quick introduction to myself, and then we'll pass it over because I have some co-hosts here that are some of the strongest partners to SmartSuite. A really exciting webinar on tap here. I'm Rick Palea. I'm a late drop in as a host in place of John Derbyshire, who's traveling today at late notice. I lead the customer organization here at SmartSuite. So I have the pleasure of working with prospective and current customers all over the globe. Truly an international representation of our customers, as we can see as evidenced here in the chat. And it's the same deal with our customer base. So joined today by, first I'll pass it over to Ben, if you'd like to give a quick intro.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So yeah, I'm the president of Automation Helpers. I run our services team. So any implementation that we do, whether it's SmartSuite, Noloco, or anything else in the space, I run the services side of Automation Helpers. And we've been a SmartSuite partner, I think from the beginning. It's been about a year and a half, almost 2 years that we've been partners with SmartSuite. And then also with Noloco, since the SmartSuite integration came out, that's really what kicked off our partnership with Noloco. So it's been 7, 8 months now. So really excited to be here and talking with Rick and Darragh.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Ben. Yeah, y'all must have been one of the first through the gates, like super early partners to us. Very much appreciate that. And Darragh as well. Hello, Darragh.
Hey, great to see you again, Rick, and thanks for having us here. Yeah, so everyone, I'm the founder and CEO of Noloco. Slightly more complicated to explain, but some of you probably already noticed Noloco is a highly flexible no-code platform designed to create rapid custom business apps. It's similar to Noloco in many ways, but it integrates, or sorry, it's similar to SmartSuite in many ways, but it integrates beautifully. And we integrate with SmartSuite and other no-code tools and databases to let you build on top of the systems and workflows that you're already using. I'll dive into a little of a deeper overview in just a few minutes, but yeah, great to be here, and I'm looking forward to seeing Ben's demo.
Perfect. And I'll give a quick bit here about SmartSuite, and then Darragh will pass it over to you to share some of Noloco, and then Ben, you can bring our worlds together and share your story. So SmartSuite is a workflow management platform. Think of it as a relational database. So for your structured data, ways to connect and create relationships between your data, combined with task and project management, which is often in a different tool. So it's very common that you might be using databases to manage your data, and then you're also working that data in another tool, sending it back and forth between different systems. And then we also have ways of getting unstructured data similar to Google Docs or Notion, all in the same hybrid platform, right? So no matter the business process, no matter the workflow, SmartSuite has ways of maneuvering your data, creating structure, and then creating automations to act like a conductor to manage the work. That's the very simple of SmartSuite. We'll get into more details here shortly. Looking at the names here on the invite list, I think we have folks that are quite familiar with what we do here. But want to pass it over to Darragh, as Noloco has been really for a while now one of our very strongest front end portal partners. And I know you do more than that, Darragh, but I won't do it justice. Yeah, please feel free.
Thanks, Rick. I love that intro from you guys as well. Really strong. So yeah, like I fumbled over just a few minutes ago, Noloco it's a whole platform. Rick accurately describe it as a front-end portal builder, but we do slightly more. Like SmartSuite, we transform your time-consuming manual workflows, such as those that you do on pen and paper, spreadsheets, and databases, into custom apps that function on both desktop and mobile. So I guess in one way of thinking about it, SmartSuite takes a spreadsheet and database layer first approach. I know they have amazing tools for making that much better, but we take an application layer first, which is slightly different strengths. So we integrate with SmartSuite and there's some other popular no-code tools. And with Noloco, you can build both internal tools and customer-facing portals. And I think this is what we're going to focus on today, because we have powerful permissions that allow for user-specific configuration. So that means you can show some users some of your records. Say a manager should see everything, whereas you might also be able to expose some of your SmartSuite data to outside third-party people like clients and so on. When you build an app on Noloco with SmartSuite, as Ben is going to show us, you use the same tables, use the same fields, and use the same data. That means any change you make to your data in Noloco is instantly reflected in SmartSuite, and any change you make in SmartSuite is synced back to Noloco in a couple of seconds. And this allows you to build really custom and intuitive user-friendly apps that can restrict what data each user role can see, or formalize different workflows and processes through action buttons, and really anything else that you can think of. Anything you're doing on SmartSuite, you can supplement that with a Noloco app. And yeah, since we kicked off the integration back in October, we've had just so many different amazing apps come through the kind of pipeline. Ben's been working on a huge bunch of, well, Ben and his team at Automation Helpers, and I'm sure Ben would like to work on each and every one, but he's a busy man. But I think today he's going to show us something really cool that kind of really sums up what I've just been rambling on about.
Perfect. Yeah, Ben, take it away.
Yeah. So I think today the plan is to talk through our story, how we use SmartSuite and Noloco internally automation helpers, but it's also a similar story that all of our customers and clients have as well. So generally what we do is we'll start with a backend build like SmartSuite. So we'll build out the data structure because the data is the platform, or I guess the base for everything else that needs to happen. So what we've seen is SmartSuite is a fantastic tool to use internally, and it's really quick to get these data structures up and going and to even build applications and workflows that teams can use. We've been using SmartSuite since our inception. So since we started as a partner with SmartSuite, we've been using SmartSuite for our own internal processes. And it was about last year when we first started using Noloco for some of our clients that we were like, oh, we should be doing this as well for our clients. The journey that we've taken to use SmartSuite and Noloco to power our own internal processes, we're going to weave some stories in from clients that we've helped as well. But the use cases that we'll talk about, we're going to start in SmartSuite today, and then we're going to go to Noloco to experience what it's like building in SmartSuite and then building on top of that platform with Noloco's data. So before I get into the demo, the two use cases that we're going to talk about in SmartSuite have been pretty common with almost all of our clients. What happens is our clients will start in SmartSuite and build out a few tables and then run into a blocker. And then they come to us to help them either get past that point, or sometimes they're really just time starved and don't have the time themselves to build everything. So they come to us to help them scale their operations. That's really the main use case, is taking these small companies. So we work mainly with companies that are between 5 and say 20, sometimes 50 employees, to help them automate their processes from the very beginning when they first start working with their clients and customers, all the way to the end when they do invoicing. So you think the three main functions of a business are: you have to find customers, you have to service your customers, and then you have to collect payment in some form or another. And so that's the use case that we're going to talk about today, is I guess the last two: servicing customers and then collecting payment from customers. And so the two main problems that we see that customers come to us for help with, I think the first is the relationship between tables. So one use case that we're going to talk about today is automatically connecting information from one table to another table. So I guess a common use case that could illustrate this is, let's say that you have a lead generation form on your website. And when the lead comes in, you either want to check if the account exists for that lead. And if it does, you want to associate that lead with the account. And if it doesn't exist, then you would want to create a new account. So that automation there to check if an account exists helps with duplication of data, because you don't want a million accounts with each contact that comes in. You want that data to be clean, and vice versa. If a new contact comes in, creating that account record, if an automation can do that for you, like, why take the time to do that yourself? So that's a fairly common use case that we see. Another one that we see is a little bit more technical. It's called a junction table. So between two different tables or data sets, being able to relate those data sets together in an easy way is often difficult to do. So we're going to talk through those two use cases today: how to use automations to create and associate data records together, and then how to use automations to create and manage those junction tables to keep data really clean. So let me go ahead and share on my screen, and we can jump into it with SmartSuite. So you should be seeing.
As someone that I was just going to say, as someone who sits on the other end of our support from time to time, I think the two use cases you're about to cover are something that might not relate to everyone right now, but once you dive into it, you realize it's basically at the core of every sort of app that you, or every sort of workflow that you build. So great stuff.
So just to confirm, you're seeing the SmartSuite screen?
That's right.
We can see it. Yeah.
Okay, so with our use case, the way that we manage projects is obviously we have customers, but customers can have multiple projects that they they'll run with us. So sometimes it's building on a CRM, sometimes it's an integration because we do everything from apps, portals, and integrations with tools like Make and Relay. And at a project level, there's also smaller bite-sized pieces that we need to take, and we call those features. So it's really our project management process. And then at a feature level, we're also tracking time because the way that we operate as a business is we give scopes for how long a project would take, but then we're going to be logging time against those scopes as we're progressing with the project. And when we first started with SmartSuite, it was much simpler than this. We had two different tables. We had time logs and invoices. And I think with most businesses, when you come to SmartSuite, you do want to keep it simple because it's almost like a living organism that evolves and takes shape over time. Workflow automations and using SmartSuite and Noloco, what I've discovered is it's an ever-evolving thing that can grow with your business and then with your knowledge of no code. And that's what's happened with us. Initially, we started with time logs to just keep track of how we were operating because it was me and Dan, my co-founder. With the two of us, because we were both logging time and running invoices, it was pretty easy. Every time that we would come in to log time at the end of the week, we would create the invoice at the same time. And there wasn't a lot of time overhead in that overall process. But as we've scaled out and we have 20 consultants on our team now, it's been much more difficult to just keep track of everyone's projects and how they've been in flight, and then automating the invoice process. So we're on our third or fourth iteration of SmartSuite and Noloco. So what we see here, if you're not at this point, just know it takes time to get to a place where everything's put together. And although you may not be in a business that runs projects and logs time, we have a lot of customers that do. We also have customers that are in the e-commerce space where you're managing orders and order line items. And so that data structure of an order and an order line item could be very similar to an invoice and an invoice line item. And we also work with a lot of construction companies. And within construction, you might have a project and then a number of products that go into that project. And so keeping track of each product that is going to be used is very similar, where you have that relationship where there's one project, but many products, or one order and many order line items or items that go into the order line items. So what we're going to go through is an automation that we put together recently to manage this process of taking time logs and rolling them up into an invoice. Because when we were initially doing it, we were manually saying, okay, these time logs belong to this project, and this project should be invoiced this week. And for every project, we were taking about an hour to put the invoice together. And as we've scaled, that just hasn't been feasible. And so we recently went through a rework to automate this process to when a time log is entered to either create an invoice automatically or add it to an existing invoice. So to give you an example of how this works, we have two different customers that we're showing here. So Hooli and Pied Piper. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enter a new record for an existing project. So let's say that we were running an automation or creating an automation, I should say, to log time. So similar to what we're doing now. So for the project, I'm going to connect this to an existing project, and I'll just select myself as the person that's completing it, and then put in some time. Let's say that it took 3 hours and 7 minutes. Once I save it, it'll automatically add it to our list here. And then what happens on the back end, that this invoice line item, we have an automation on the back end that's going through and saying, okay, does an invoice line item exist already for this project? And if it doesn't, then it creates a new one. So if we actually go over to the invoice line items, that it was just added there, and that an invoice was just created. So this is actually a multi-step automation where first it'll look to see if an invoice line item exists with the same date. And if it doesn't, then it creates a new one like it just did for us. And then the next step is the invoice line item will look at the invoices and go through the same process and say, does an invoice exist with the right date and for the right customer? And if it does, it'll add it to the invoice. And if it doesn't, then it creates it automatically. And so for us, it's done two different things. So the first thing that it's done is it's given us real-time view of how projects are going. So I can now that we have a bigger team, I can just come to invoices and see, okay, looks like for this week that we have one project that's in flight and that we're going to be working on. And for the last week, it's really easy to see how many customers we've invoiced and for how much we've done that without having to do any manual work myself of working through spreadsheets or processing that data. So this is saving us probably 20, 25 hours a week. And what that means is at our current stage, we either would have had to hire a bookkeeper or a finance person to manage this for us, or it would have significantly eaten into my day-to-day. And so now I get to spend more time with customers and with the team, training them on how to use SmartSuite, how to use Noloco, and solving customer problems as opposed to focusing on the day-to-day kind of back-end operations that aren't adding value to our customers. To take a second on just talking through this, maybe I'll show you the automation quickly and how we put that together. So that way we can get a sense of just what it takes and what it looks like putting an automation together in SmartSuite. So for me, I come from a coding background. I've participated in actual builds of B2B software applications. I've also built out a few different consumer applications. And one of the things that I've seen coming into the no-code space is the process is very similar as far as building an application. There's the same stages where you have to go through the ideation, and we call it scoping, but really understanding the problem to be solved. Previously, when we were working in custom code, we would do wireframing and storyboarding to say what the workflow was going through the application. And one of the things that no code does that has allowed us to really deploy these applications quickly is we no longer need to worry about the infrastructure of putting the servers up and building the website. All of that's given to us with SmartSuite and with Noloco. So that allows us to shift our focus from the technical build to the business problems that need to be solved. Knowing the technical process, though, is very helpful, especially when working with things like automations where we need to have different conditions and just think through the steps in the process for how that works. And so I think this is one of the reasons why many of our clients get tripped up at this stage, is because it goes from a business problem to almost more of a technical issue to solve the problem of automating the creation of these records. So to give you an idea of how to set this up, one of the things I do before creating an automation is I just pull out my notepad and scratch down a few notes of, okay, when the record's created, we need to check these certain conditions. So in our case, we want to make sure that somebody's assigned to the time log, that there's an actual amount for the time log so that it can roll up into the invoice in the right way. And then we're also checking to make sure that the invoice line item hasn't been assigned yet, because if it has, we don't need to run the automation. And so after checking these conditions, the automation will kick off. And what we're doing is just running a find record step to look for the invoice line item to see if it exists. So we check if the project is the same as the project on the time log. And then we're also checking the invoice date. So we have a formula where we're calculating the activity date. And so we look at the invoice date on the time log and see if it's after the activity date. And that way we know which time invoice line item to associate it to. And so if we find a record, we'll update the time log. And then we actually have another field that we're using to kick off the next automation. So this existing invoice automation complete is a way to tell SmartSuite to kick off the next automation to create the invoice line item if it hasn't been created. And what this will do is it cascades the automations until we have the end of the process where the invoice is created or the time log is added to an existing invoice. So going through this process, it takes a bit to work through and to understand how the data is flowing through. But once you have it set up, it's one of those things where it's one and done, and now we don't have to worry about updating time logs to invoices anymore. So this feature of SmartSuite, I feel like is almost a hidden power, where when we were first coming into SmartSuite, at least my view was like, okay, let's get the data structured in the right way. And unlocking the automations was almost like a cheat code where it's allowed us to spend less time entering and maintaining data and focusing more on getting work done. Because the beauty of SmartSuite and Noloco is yes, you want to use them, but for us now, it's almost more like we come in to view the dashboards as opposed to coming in and maintaining the data that's providing the insights that are powering the dashboards on the back end. So through this process, I guess we covered those two main use cases. In this case, the invoice line items is that junction table that we were discussing earlier. The invoice line items ties together an invoice with a time log. And so we could add a time log directly to an invoice, and that's what we were doing previously. But the reason that we created the invoice line items is we had feedback from customers that they wanted to know what, from a high level, what was happening on the invoice. And for us, we went through the struggle of knowing how much detail to provide to customers, and as opposed to keeping it more high level to make it easier to digest. Because what we had been doing previously is we would just take all of the time logs and put them into one invoice line item. And you can imagine the problem that would create if you're running an order, right? You can't just throw every product into one order line item. When you're going through a checkout process, you need to be able to see, okay, how many items am I purchasing? Which items am I purchasing? And what are the quantities of each of those items? And so it's really important to split that out, to have that detail of what's going up in that either order table or invoice table or project table. But you also don't want to get too deep and have a description of every single component of the product that's going into the order line item. And so the beauty of SmartSuite and Noloco is that we can get as detailed as we need to be, but we can also be as high level as we want to be as well. So when we get into Noloco, we'll see how that looks as far as generating the invoice, but still providing the customers a view of the time logs that are occurring for each of the stages in a project, and also all of the time logs that are going into an invoice. So that way, if a customer does have that desire to know the detailed level, they can always go into the portal in Noloco and drill in and see the detailed view if they need to. But we're not sending all of that data and overwhelming every customer that just wants to know, okay, how much was the invoice total that was created for this week? So I think the biggest problem with no code is, as opposed to code, is not that you have to spend so much time creating these applications, but it's actually the beginning part of the process and figuring out what you actually want to create and what's the ideal experience for customers. Because the build process, it goes very quickly using no code platforms like SmartSuite and Noloco. So this is probably a good point before we jump into Noloco. If there's any questions on SmartSuite and the process that we went through of relating records from one table, like the time logs, to the invoice line items and ultimately the invoices, we can pause for some questions and talk through SmartSuite and the functionality that we have here before we get into Noloco and what that experience looks like building on top of a SmartSuite dashboard.
I'll call out too as some potential questions come in. I love the point, Ben, and I've heard this before, but it really hits home. The goal is to, once you have it set up in such an intelligent way, the least amount of time you could spend in the tool, the better. Just in essence of, can you have it working under the water like a duck on top of the water? It just seems very seamless, and you could spend more time with customers and such. So I love that mindset.
I know I'm terrible with this. You can see my notification center that I have 96 notifications, but it's because we use Slack notifications that are built into SmartSuite. So I think that's another really powerful aspect of SmartSuite's platform, is the integrations are so deep that you can choose to use it the way that makes sense, whether it's in-app notifications or Slack or email notifications. But it's almost counterintuitive that the less you use SmartSuite, the more valuable it becomes, especially from an automation and a notification standpoint.
That's fantastic. Feel free, folks, to drop questions in after the fact, SmartSuite specific. Looks like we have one. Do you have any plans to put a full-blown SmartSuite video on Udemy or something similar for training? That's interesting, Carl. We have a borderline exhaustive amount of content out there right now in various forms. Ben and his team have produced some wonderful, Dan Lehman, his partner there at Automation Helpers, produced some wonderful videos on, you name it, SmartSuite related. Similar with Noloco. So there's a lot of content out there. Getting it formally on a Udemy is an interesting strategy, probably something that we should be considering. I'm sure we are to some extent. So no, currently, yes, we can absolutely reach out to that team and connect the dots. And then Joseph, question here, what would it look like if two different tasks are completed on the same project in the same day? And what would it look like on the invoice? So I think that's a question for you, Ben.
Yeah, let's actually go through and maybe we'll go through and add some additional tasks here so that we can see what it looks like when generating the invoice. So this task that I just created, creating an automation to log time, it created an invoice line item, this last one here. And it also actually created a new invoice. So if we come over to the invoices table, we see that a new invoice was generated for Pied Piper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple more tasks. One is a task on a different project for Pied Piper. Let's say, I'm just going to call this test task. Or maybe we'll call it testing. Testing is an important part of no code. No code is pretty magical, but also important to make sure that you're doing the testing in the right way. Let's see. There's this other project that's with Pied Piper that's currently in the planning stage, but let's say that we want to kick it off and add a time log to the AI integration project. And I'll add myself as the consultant. And let's say that I spent 5 hours testing this. What's going to happen now is it will create a new task and it will also generate a new invoice line item, but it's going to include it on the existing invoice because even though it's a new invoice line item because it's associated with a new project, an invoice already exists for Pied Piper for this upcoming week. So it will associate it with the existing invoice that's already there. And then any other time logs that I add, so maybe we do internal training for the AI integration. If we add internal training, then because everything exists already for the invoice line item and the invoice, everything will just flow through and connect to the existing records. So I won't enter the invoice line item since that should exist already. Let's say that it's 4 hours and 43 minutes. It'll do that connection for us. So I think to the question, if there's multiple tasks that are entered the same day, the automation will handle that process and add it to the right invoice line item and ultimately to the right invoice as well. So if we come to the invoices now, you see with the tasks that we had about 5 hours and then another 3 hours. So looks like about 13 hours altogether. And then on the invoice, if we look at sometimes it takes a second to update everything. So once this is completely updated, we should have about 13 hours for this invoice or $1,300 since this customer's billed at $100 an hour. So
Well
does
said.
that answer the question or any follow-ups?
I think it does. Yeah, Joseph, feel free to let us know if that didn't do it. There's one twist that he added at the end, a twist to the question. What if it's the same task at two different times on the same day?
The same task at two different times. So one of the things that we see, the way that we run time logs at least, is that a time log can be added. We don't have a task level. A lot of our customers do have a task level where it may go like a project and then a feature or a phase. And then the level down would be a task. And then time logs are created against those tasks. And if I'm understanding correctly, what I would imagine is two time logs being created against the same task would do something similar here, where it would roll up into the task, and then we would just have an aggregate view of the total time for those two time logs against that one task. So that's the beauty of the automation and also the data structure is that we can do those roll-ups to calculate the sum of all of the time logs or all of the tasks that would go into an invoice line item or an invoice. So I believe that's what the question was asking. If it was two time logs or two entries in a time log, it would function similar to the way that two tasks being entered on the same day would function.
Spot on. Beatrice has a question here around scalability, which is something if you're in the hundreds of thousands of records within a solution, but certainly in any tool is something to evaluate. I'll give a obviously biased SmartSuite take, just given the thousands of customers we work with. And then Ben, feel free, straight honest truth here. So the question is just around encountering any issues regarding number of records with possibly lagging as you hit some of those higher record levels. We have different plan types, smartsuite.com/pricing. Very clear cut. There's no black box with our pricing. You should be able to see all the plan inclusions directly there at smartsuite.com/pricing. And in our enterprise plan for folks that are scaling up to higher volumes, the current limit we have in place is 250,000 records. And that's not to say that we don't have customers that are pushing us past those bounds. The reality is this: when you have large records in any system, one component of performance and lagability is actually the device, the processing power of the device that you're on. So we have customers that have 5,000 records in a solution, and they might be on an old PC, something a bit dated, and they'll let us know they experience lags, and we're often not able to replicate it. And then we have customers that have 200,000 plus records in a solution, and it operates quite snappy just because of the device you're using. I'm not saying that's the only factor. I'm saying that is something to consider. There are also intelligent ways, because of how SmartSuite is structured and the ability to relate records across any solution, that you really shouldn't need to be looking at 2, 3, 4, 500,000 records at one place at one time. So I think it comes down to, and I know Ben's team are the absolute masters at this, it comes down to the architecture and just intelligently creating it so you can access these amounts of data in a reporting basis, in comparison, however you would need it. So that's my take. But Ben, feel free. I know that sometimes for customers, you're pumping in large numbers of records here.
Yeah. So to add on that, I think the most common limitation is actually more on the architecture after the device. Like, I think the architecture does come next. And the great thing about SmartSuite is you can split up data into different solutions. And then Noloco can also manage that really well too, where you can pull in data from multiple different solutions. And so if you're running into those limits, the first thing that we go through is, okay, can we split this out into separate solutions? Can we optimize the architecture to make things run faster? And then if there is still a limit on records, a lot of consumer companies may be processing a lot of orders, or if you're trying to log data for reporting, there might be use cases where you do need to capture that data. More often than not, that data needs to be real time as opposed to having the total historical values. And so in those cases, we'll build in like a backup process to another system to offload records that are older than a certain date. So often, it's just the most recent, the month that we need the most latest records. So we'll connect with a system like BigQuery, or sometimes it's just creating CSVs and then exporting them to Google Drive. So there's a number of different processes to manage the limitations on the record limits. But for us, with, I'd say, all but one client, we've been able to solve the record limit issue with just re-architecting the system in the right way.
Appreciate that take. And this follow-up question here from Joseph, separate question, I think leads us in nicely to the Noloco bit. Can we take a peek at the invoice? I believe you're showing that within Noloco, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. The invoice bit here. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can take a look at that here before we run to Noloco.
Yeah.
So the way that we're running the invoices, we use formulas, but it's similar to a rollup where we're using some if statements and then also some logic to just calculate the numbers in the right way. Because we have historical data that's rolling up from the task and not through an invoice line item, we had to account for that. But it's essentially just saying, let's take the sum of all of the billable hours for the invoice line items to get the total hours for the invoice. And then from there, we multiply it by our hourly rate to get the calculated amount for the invoice. You might have noticed on time logs, and this is what we've seen too, is over the course of time, there's additional functionality or features that are needed in the process. So for us, like we have this item for percent billable, and if we were to change this to 60%, sometimes we're going through a task and we're like, okay, we spent some time learning like a new technology in order to get this task done. So we have this billable percentage in order to change the amount that we're actually invoicing clients. So that way we can keep track of how much we're going to pay our team members, because that'll be separate from what we invoice clients. For us, we've added these little features over the course of time to account for the different use cases that we have. But ultimately with invoices, it's pretty simple, just rolling up the hours from all of the tasks, I guess all of the invoice line items, and then pulling those from the time logs in order to get the total hours, and then multiplying it by our hourly rate in order to get the calculated amount for the invoice. And that is a good segue for going into Noloco, because in Noloco, and to give a perspective of why we use Noloco, especially when there's so much overlap between functionality in Noloco and SmartSuite, really the key differentiator, I think, in why so many of our customers wanted or needed a portal on top of their SmartSuite implementation is because it's a really easy way to get your clients involved in the process, either from just giving them updates on information all the way to having them participate in some of the processes that you may have. So from an invoice standpoint, for example, a lot of our customers were asking us about their past invoices that they had paid. And so when we first started working with Noloco, we were like, oh, this is an easy way to do it. Because with SmartSuite, it is feasible, but it would take a bit of work to set up the permissions and to give the right access to customers. Whereas with Noloco, it was easy to set the permissions up. And it's also more of an app-like feel where we can set the UI in a way that makes sense based on the process that we're working through. So we're pulling all of the invoice data from SmartSuite. And if I go into one of these, I think this is an older invoice from Pied Piper, for example. One of the other great aspects of Noloco is it allows us to test the functionality based on the user role really quickly. So I can come down here and say, hey, let's test it as the customer. And if not too much has changed, but you'll notice that generate invoice or send to QuickBooks button that we had before is now gone, because internally we want our team to be able to create the invoice, but obviously that's not a functionality that we want the customers to have. So with Noloco, it's easy to create those experiences where we're limiting or I guess creating the ideal experience for the right user. So internally, even though we need to see the details, we also need to be able to edit the details and take certain actions. And Noloco makes it easy to add those features or restrict them when it makes sense. So let me just remove this. And to give you an idea of how this can also work, one of the main use cases that we saw for Noloco is in complex processes that are changing their view or changing in technology terms, it's called state. But say for a project that has 6 or 7 different statuses, and at each status you need to take, say, 2 or 3 different actions. In Noloco, you can change the interface at each step in an automatic way. So that way the team members or the users that are coming into the system don't have to remember where to click to make the updates. The system just shows them what they need to make. So to give an example of that, if I click this button, send to quick, it's going to change the button and it'll show that it's creating the invoice in QuickBooks. And then once the invoice is generated, the button will disappear completely. And so it's really easy to create these experiences that match what needs to be done. And so that way your users don't have to think, okay, what do I need to do at this point? And I think it highlights that point that Darragh was making. SmartSuite is really great at building the data structure out. And I think for your internal power users, it's quick to work in SmartSuite because you have the columns and the rows, and you can move through creating records and viewing data very quickly. Whereas with the complex processes where things are changing very quickly, it makes sense to use Noloco to manage those changes and present the right data at the right time. And once the invoice is generated, what we do is we give our customers the link where they can open the invoice and it has all of the data for them right there. So we're not having to email them and they're not having to contact us to access past invoices and past amounts. So this was one of the biggest things that offloaded a lot of support work for us, where each request that came in from a client, obviously we would respond to that request, but it wasn't moving the needle. It wasn't helping the project get done. It wasn't providing any additional value to customers. So the portal allows them to self-service. And with the portal, it's available 24/7. Whereas for us, we were only available normally during business hours to respond to requests. So this created a more transparent way for our clients to work with us and for us to service them in the right way without having to manually give them updates on how things were going day to day.
I think you highlighted a few great things there, Ben. For those, it almost happens very fast. there's a few things that I think you covered, like visibility rules on that button. When you switch to viewing it as a client, the generate invoice button disappeared. But then also once the invoice was generated, even as Ben, the admin, that button disappeared. And yeah, that's what I was trying to get at in the beginning of the call, which is with Noloco, yeah, you're working on the same data, but you can define your processes much more accurately so that you know exactly what actions you should take at what stage of a record's life cycle, whether it's an invoice or a project or a task, and you're putting up guardrails. I don't know if you're covering this in your demo, but I noticed in your automation, when you were adding a time log, you had to check that the time was like not empty, and you had to check that the client was not empty and stuff like that. Which is, it occurred to me that you could completely prevent that with a validation rules in our forms, right? If that was the process you set up for your team.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that term that you used, Noloco is really great about setting those guardrails up. It's probably one of the key aspects that helps Noloco, or I guess helps us with our data integrity, where we don't have to worry that as we're inputting time, or to give you an example with clients, with the projects that we work on. So with this AI, actually, let me come back. There's, yeah, this platform or this project here. We want customers to be able to participate and request features to the project. But we also want to make sure that it's requested in the right way. So if we add a feature that the project is pre-filled in this form. So it makes it easy to put those guardrails in place. That way we're not selecting any random project or making the customer select the project and wait, what project are we in? And so it ensures data integrity, and then it takes that cognitive load of deciding or figuring out what to do off of the user, and it puts it on the system. And that's the whole purpose of automation, is to have those guardrails in place to make it easy to do what we need to do.
You could also do things like, if they're gonna set a due date, make sure it's after the start date, and most importantly, not yesterday. Make sure it's actually in the future, that sort of thing. Maybe you've already got this set up, but
yeah, we need to add that. So yeah,
it's also right because you probably get feature requests over email, over Slack, over the phone calls, right? And now you can just say, actually, that's a great idea. Could you just log that in the portal so that it's all tracked and accredited, and as you said, in the system with all the right details?
Yeah. So this gets to the point of transparency with customers, and then I think organization, because one of the things that we often hear is when you come from a system where you're working off of spreadsheets, those two main use cases that we talked about in SmartSuite are really the first step. It's okay, how can we organize the data and associate them in the right way and automate the connection between something like a time log and an invoice? And then after that is developed in the system, then getting at these more granular features of like, how can we ensure that each field in a feature request that's submitted matches the data that we're expecting? And Noloco really helps with the data integrity and then the organization and visibility that we're giving the clients when we're building out these applications.
We'd love to hear questions that we have for Ben or for the Noloco team here. I know there are a lot of SmartSuite folks on the line that are probably quite familiar with what we do. So perhaps this is a newer technology for you to at least be seeing or considering. We'll see some questions come through.
Yeah, one thing I think it'd be great to call out here as well. So we obviously with Rick, when you're answering the question around data scaling and stuff, you mentioned that SmartSuite is fantastic in that it allows you to link between different solutions. So you might have your clients in one table, in one solution, but then all your time tracking in a different solution. Ben alluded to this, but I might as well double down on it, is with Noloco, we actually out of the box support importing multiple solutions into the one app. And when we detect that SmartSuite has linked some fields to the other solution that you have imported, we actually automatically tie those together. So in this example, if the project was in a different solution, you could still view those features or those tasks from that other solution on the same page here, completing the circle that is somewhat broken, say, in SmartSuite, but for good reason. I don't know how much you want to share, Ben, but if you have that set up, it'd be great. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. You can build as many as you need, to be perfectly honest, as well as mixing and matching with, say, Google Sheets, if your sales team are still insistent on using something archaic, sometimes you just can't escape it.
So for us, that's the way that we've done it, is when you're automating your entire business. And for us, we have, I guess, three main areas. It's the CRM, and then our projects, which we were looking at, and then our internal team, where we have, like, we've built out an applicant tracking system, and that's where we process like payroll for our team. And so we've split it up into different solutions because that's really what you want. You want data that is alike to exist together, both in tables and in solutions. And being able to connect everything together, from the CRM to our project management system, to our backend people operations, and have it all interconnected just makes it really easy. Knowing that we can set it up in SmartSuite and that it's going to work, it really is out of the box, because Darragh was saying, when you build those connections in, what Noloco does is it looks at the table structure, and it will pull the appropriate data and the appropriate relationships and give you almost a default. It does give you a default view in the application builder. And of course, after the default, taking the time to go through and show the right fields at the right time, that's where the work is spent, as opposed to trying to build the connection and like pulling the right data from SQL and building the right joins and ensuring that it's built in an optimal way. Like, really the focus is on, what do our customers need? What's the business problem that we're trying to solve, as opposed to, how does this technically work? How do we put this together? And how is the back end, the SQL system, working with our front end visual UI? For us, it really was the day that the connection came out in October between Noloco and SmartSuite, where we just started building. And it was really amazing how quickly we were able to do that. I think our first implementation was in November. So it only took a month to go from started to having the connection live to having a customer actually using that. And I think we're a few dozen projects now that are using SmartSuite and Noloco.
Love that, Ben. I know one thing that Darragh's team took quite a bit of care in building the actual integration is we have 45 different field types. It's a lot of different types of data. And they were maniacal about understanding how they could connect as many of those as possible. Some of them are quite complex in terms of how the data flows. So you'll see more options in terms of the interconnectivity between Noloco and SmartSuite that you may see between other tools of the like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
the
actually
due
really
date there
big.
is a good example.
So like this duration field, I know duration is pretty tricky, right? Because you're using hours, minutes, and seconds, and having that work just out of the box was, I think, one of the reasons why we were able to implement so quickly with so many clients.
Definitely. Joseph had a good question there that actually follows on to that, is if adding a feature or task in the context of this solution here, does it talk back to SmartSuite? If you create a new task log, does it get written back? The answer for me anyway is yes, absolutely. So instantly. So as Ben can demonstrate here, anytime you make a change to your SmartSuite in Noloco, it'll instantly be written back to SmartSuite. And any change written from SmartSuite will get synced back to Noloco within a couple of seconds. So it's ever so slightly slower, but nothing to be slowed down by.
So I'm just updating a record here, right? 4 hours.
Putting out the spot here.
And there we go. So really just within
right. Very good.
it's making an update.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think Jeffrey there had a question around like a reporting engine or designer for printed reports. We don't have anything native like I know SmartSuite does, but we do have an integration with another platform which is called Docs Automator. And that allows you to do invoices, do receipts, do printing labels, that sort of stuff based on your SmartSuite data and your Noloco data. And we have workflows that work similar to SmartSuite's automations that allow you to wire that up pretty natively.
That's actually a good question for Rick. Is with the PDF generator, I imagine you can put reports together in there. One of the things we often recommend, SmartSuite and Noloco are really great at building dashboards out of the box. And I know building printable reports, often you want to see like a table view like this. And SmartSuite does have a built-in PDF generation that you can use. So Rick, I don't know if there's anything extra to say about that, but it really does come pretty easily. Building reports and dashboards, at least natively in the solutions, printing it out, there's a variety of ways to do it in the depending on the solution.
Yeah, no, well said. There is a field that I think is often neglected in our field options called a button field. That button field allows you to have a dynamic URL in there. And that dynamic URL we're seeing used in some really interesting ways, essentially to create webhooks. So out of the box, we don't have webhooks per se, but we do. And I think we've got an upcoming webinar here in just a few weeks where we have a customer who's going to show some of those capabilities. So the URL formula, so you have static URL down there, and we won't go too deep into that, but Ben, you see where it's that URL formula? Yeah. So you have the ability here to create some really complex structuring of what actually gets done. So this button can perform any action that you can conceive in essence. And one of those could be saving file, creating PDFs and saving them back to a Google Drive, or generating invoices directly, or saving to, yeah, I could go on and on about this. It's exciting to see what people are building with this capability. And we've got on the short-term roadmap the ability to create action buttons here within your actual tables, so more visible. And to Darragh's point, super important to make sure that you can control who can access certain things and who may not even see those in the first place. But buttons right now do give you the ability to do some of that, Ben.
Mhm. Yeah, so similar to what we saw in Noloco, the buttons, yeah, work in SmartSuite in a similar way.
Awesome. We're rounding home, but there is, let's see, and I have a question here for Landon. I unfortunately have a hard stop in 1 minute, and it looks like some folks are dropping. I will say, we have people here. Thank you for joining us. I know I speak on behalf of Ben and Darragh in saying we like to share a story. We like to share what we're working on, the creative inspiration that you all might have that you bring to us as partners, customers, et cetera. Just keeps driving how we're innovating this space. And more than anything else, no code is a very viable solution for any type of business. Put us through the ringer, put us through the test. I think the traditional ways of development will always be there, but we are all extremely bullish on what can be built in tools like Noloco and SmartSuite. For anyone that can linger, Landon looks like has a question here. I think Darragh's answering that, and then Oscar, and then we'll wrap up if there are no other questions. Okay.
Yeah, do you want me to answer his
Yeah, go for it.
question?
Yeah, go for it, Darragh. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to say basically, so the question is about around using Noloco for the possibility of B2B transactions, multiple products in Noloco acting like e-commerce. We actually see this a fair bit. So I like to clarify, you can't build like a public app with Noloco. So you're not going to replace Shopify. Like, they're good at e-commerce, let them do e-commerce. But if you have a B2B business where some of your customers need to order, whether it's hardware or assets or something like that, periodically, then you can build a Noloco app that kind of facilitates that ordering. And very similar to what Ben showed today, you can automate the kind of invoicing of that as well. At the end of the day, a product is not that different than a time in an invoice. You know what I mean? So the solution ends up being very similar as a matter of fact. But so we have a few people doing that. If you want to learn more, by all means, reach out and we can talk through how to do that.
And then Oscar, bringing us home. Have you encountered clients that want to use a separate solution for each project, especially for large, complex projects? Do you find that separating to be necessary, or is it just an overcomplication when building in the system? Ben, maybe that's a question for you, or Darragh. You probably have some experience there too. I think he's referring to bringing over multiple solutions and projects into one place in Noloco, I think.
Yeah, so from a data architecture standpoint, if you're ever like trying to create multiple tables or individual table for each client, that's a good indication that a re-architecture may be useful. So yeah, I'd say when in that case, it would be better to have a simple architecture and more records as opposed to trying to separate it out into a different solution for each project.
We see this a lot, so much so that we've written a guide and a blog post about it. If you want to Google Noloco, deciding between multiple apps or one, as Ben said, it's usually a red flag that it usually comes from a place of people not understanding that you can use permissions to say your data based on a client column, right? And it's not even that difficult to implement. It's just adding one extra table and that link from projects to clients. The only time that it might make sense is if each project is like very unique. And that all of the fields are just completely different. At that stage, though, you're just building different things each time. And when you import it to say Noloco, you will have to rebuild the interface for each different project in that case. But so sometimes it is merit, but usually not.
Good use case in that situation may be having a template that you copy over for each project. But again, with that data structure, it's just one other table for the template, and then you're customizing each project as it comes through.
Exactly.
Well, Jens, any closing thoughts here?
Just really excited. If you do need to reach out, I know Darragh and Rick are both very responsive. And then for us, if you need to get in contact with us, if you go to our contact page, automationhelpers.com, happy to talk with anyone that has questions or needs help as far as implementing Noloco or SmartSuite.
Perfect.
Likewise, thanks for joining us. Thanks for having us on. Ben and his team at Automation Helpers have worked on so many SmartSuite and Noloco projects at this point. You could probably do it in his sleep. Do take that offer of his sincerely. He'll build a really fantastic solution for you and your business, and one that you probably need. Yeah, and again, thanks very much. Any questions about Noloco, you can obviously get me on noloco.io.
Brilliant. Thanks all for joining. Still have a good contingent waiting to the end. As for our weekly webinars, okay, just some commentary at the end. We always like to get feedback from these. Yes, you will get automatic, soon as this processes, you will get an automatic email to you with just a kind of a recap and the ability to go back and look at it. But let us know what you want to see more of. And these sort of joint webinars with technology partners in this space are critical for us, again, to move the space forward. Thanks, Ben, for connecting the dots so beautifully today. And thanks all for joining. Have a good one. Take care.